Hello and welcome, and in this lecture we're going to be talking about Aristotle on tragedy, and I'm going to be relying heavily on Julian Jung's Philosophy of Tragedy, chapter 2, to sort of set the scene and describe Aristotle's theory. And the text from Aristotle where this theory is related and where this theory comes from is in a text called the Poetics. It's a fairly short text, and it's Aristotle's theory of art. It's the oldest sort of systematic theory of art that we have, and it's called the Poetics, which comes from this Greek word poiesis, which in essence means a kind of making or creating. Right. So the first thing to note is it's not just about poetry. It's not just about the written word. Poetics from poiesis refers to this kind of making, creating. So it's about art in general, any kind of sort of creative, any kind of creative making, any kind of sort of artistic fabricating. That's the general sense here. So we're going to be focused on tragedy. A lot of times will be the comments and the points I'll be making refer to both art and tragedy as well. So tragedy is the kind of contained within art as art is the larger category. So just it's important to bear in mind that sort of relationship where all the sort of comments we make about art will also be true of tragedy. Tragedy is kind of the more specific thing, and Aristotle will have very specific things to say on tragedy as well, which is of course our interest in this chapter and in Aristotle's Poetics. Okay, so what we're going to have to look at is Aristotle's criticisms of Plato and Plato's views of art, and by implication of tragedy. So in the Poetics, we'll see that Aristotle develops this theory of art that responds to some of Plato's criticisms. And Aristotle focuses on how art can make us better people, better informed, more emotionally stable, and give us insight about things. So Aristotle has a much more positive view of art in the Poetics than we saw from Plato in the Republic. We saw some of those criticisms earlier in this course from Plato's Republic. And Aristotle is really taking issue with those claims and wants to set out how art and tragedy actually have a role in public culture that has an influence on people, that can improve us emotionally and intellectually. So we're going to look carefully at those arguments and see what Aristotle is referring to. Aristotle associates art in general with this term that he uses called mimesis, and it essentially means a kind of copying or representing, and it's familiar nowadays with the word mime and miming, which is a kind of copying and representing. So that's the origin of the word mimesis. So tragedy and poetry in general, Aristotle says, are a form of mimesis. Unlike Plato, however, Aristotle is going to suggest that images or representations can teach us about the essence of things, right? And we remember that view from Plato's Republic, that images or representations are have no sort of cognitive merit. They're derived in a sort of triple sense from the essence of things. They're not sort of craftsmen's fabrications. They're just images of those fabrications. And so they're sort of far removed from the essence, which, as we saw, Plato talked of in terms of form. Aristotle is going to criticize that view and tell us that these images or representations can actually teach us about things. And we see this reflected in this famous painting by Raphael, where we see Plato and Aristotle represented here. And we see this disagreement where art, as Aristotle says, is dealing with universal essences. So this is why he says it's more philosophical and deals with more serious things than history. And we see in the painting Plato on on the left as we're looking at it is pointing up at the heavens. Aristotle has his hand outstretched, sort of indicating that, you know, everything's already here on Earth. This is where we should be looking. So Aristotle's sort of indicating that the essences can be found down here rather than up above, and by extension, in his theory of art, he tells us they can be found in art as well. Now, the claim that philosophy is more serious than history is an interesting one. Here, the idea of history is just the kind of narration of events, the telling of why something happened, what caused it, what happened next, what happened after that, one damn thing after another. Right, so this sort of bad idea of history is just the sort of telling of what happened. Instead of doing that, what art and tragedy deals with are sort of essentials or universals, meaning that they pick out stories that don't just occur once, but are sort of patterns or types, right? So they show people in typical situations, and those situations are not a sort of one-time historical event. They're sort of replicable, repeatable situations that human beings encounter, you know, in the course of their lives, or at certain times in their lives, at certain times in the life course. So these are sort of, you know, repeatable and therefore sort of universalizable essences that we can talk about. So it's not just focusing on particular things that happen. It's picking out these generalizable events, generalizable things that people have to deal with in their lives. Not only does tragedy offer knowledge, Aristotle argues, but it offers knowledge about human nature and the types of people and their reactions in different circumstances. Right. So this is continuing the sort of universal idea. Right. Tragedy offers a kind of knowledge, and the kind of knowledge it offers is about human nature. It tells us about the types of people, in other words, the sort of character types and their reaction in different circumstances. Somebody like Oedipus, who is very sort of hot-headed, very impatient, that kind of thing, and so that sort of reaction is typified in certain circumstances, certain kinds of reactions. So it provides us this knowledge about human types. Aristotle says that characters in the play are portrayed for the sake of plot, not the plot for the sake of characters. So plot is the most important thing, right? And characters are just the kind of placeholders of experiences, of, you know, things that people that can play these roles in the plot. So characters are not sort of supposed to be these sort of unique, individualized pieces. They're more like sort of typified characters. They're types that fit into these places in the plot where they're necessary. They're types rather than genuine individuals, Aristotle suggests. So this means that plot describes general situations rather than unique ones. And again, that's in line with what we were saying about history, that what's portrayed in plot are these kind of repeatable human situations where we face these conflicts, and it may be a conflict characterized by a certain sort of emotion of jealousy or anger, or we face a certain point in the life course, the death of a father in the case of Hamlet, right? So these sort of typical situations, and plot sort of describes them, and characters are sort of types rather than individuals. What happens is how they represent human experience as a whole in these situations, not their kind of unique individual features. All right, now let's look a little more closely at Aristotle's response to two of Plato's arguments. And the first of these is the one that Jung calls the painting argument. And it will be familiar to us since we've talked about Plato's theory of forms and we know something about how that works. So the first point should be, we should be able to grasp that knowing something for Plato is a matter of grasping its form or its essence. Right, so it's not, knowing something is not knowing a material thing, as we talked about. Material things are kind of secondary copies of the essence of something which is its form, and the form is an intellectual idea, right? So the intellectual idea of a triangle, right, has three sides, 180 degrees. And any sort of triangle that we can draw is just a sort of description or an example of or a sort of embodiment of the perfect triangle. The perfect triangle is an idea, not a thing. So Plato says that art does not grasp or portray forms, but only what he takes to be the superficial outer appearance of things. And therefore, Plato concludes, art cannot provide us with knowledge. So this is the sort of, the uselessness view of art, that it sort of deals with trivia, the superficial outward appearances, and it doesn't really provide us with any genuine knowledge of things. For Plato, we know that knowledge is reserved to the forms, not to material things. And art being a material thing, therefore, doesn't qualify as a form of knowledge. Now, we've seen the answer to this already in what we've already said about Aristotle's view, and it's captured in the idea that Aristotle argues that art does in fact provide knowledge of essences. It shows us human nature in certain archetypal situations, right? So in showing us human nature in typical ways, it shows us universals, not just sort of surface superficial features, but it can show us how human nature works, how it reacts in certain circumstances, how those reactions are sort of typical, how they relate to certain human types, rather than being just about sort of these unique causal reactions. So there is a kind of knowledge of essences, Aristotle argues, that's sort of related to this idea of human types and how they react. Now, the second argument that Jung refers to as the stiff upper lip argument is about the emotions in tragedy and the role of the emotions, play. And Aristotle here is very different to Plato in giving a substantive role to the emotions, in really enlightening us and in setting out the sort of grounds of our ability to reason properly. So for Plato, it's like this, right? Art and tragedy stir up the emotions, and they thereby make it impossible to make calm, rational decisions. And this is the argument we saw in, it sort of begins in chapter 3 of the Republic, where all these sort of Plato's banning all these different, or sort of outlawing all these different theories, all these different artworks that contain these claims that show the gods doing these terrible things and so on. So this idea that sort of art stirs up our emotions and makes us emotional, we sort of are able to act rationally, and as we know for Plato, acting rationally, acting according to reason, that's what makes us human. A rational person, number 2, does their best to repress grief and other powerful emotions. That's one of Plato's central assumptions. What makes us rational is our ability to reason free of our emotions that want to sort of throw us off track. So tragedy undermines our capacity to reason by making us emotional, by sort of stirring up our emotions, and therefore should be banned. So that's Plato's argument in a nutshell. The stiff upper lip argument about the emotions and how they interfere with rational decision making. And this is sort of underpinned in Plato's theory. Just to touch on this briefly here, the theory of the soul. We know we've got 3 parts: reason, spirit, and desire. Reason is on top and searches for the truth, searches for the sort of the truths that can help us navigate the form of the good. Spirit includes aspects that can be trained, the sort of social emotions such as honor, self-esteem, that sort of thing. All these sort of aspects of our being that can ally with reason for Plato. And then there's desire, or the sort of pleasure-seeking part of ourself, which must be kept under control. So it's reason in charge, allied by spirit, with sort of desire sort of at the bottom of the pile according to Plato, but by sort of appealing to those lower parts of the soul, desire and to some extent spirit, tragedy can throw us off course, and tragedy can upend the sort of the genuine balance of the soul and lead us to make decisions that are hot-headed or rash, and that don't reflect the dominance of reason. All right, so to get Aristotle's response to this, we have to understand this idea of catharsis. So, and catharsis is sort of defined in the most important statement that Aristotle makes in the Poetics about tragedy, and this is the statement right here. He says, "A tragedy is the imitation," that's mimesis, "of an action that is serious, unlike comedy, of course, and also as having magnitude, complete in itself, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions." Okay, so to kind of sharpen that a little bit, the essence of this definition is that in tragedy something happens to the emotions pity and fear. What happens to them is a kind of catharsis, right? And that's the core of the tragic effect. That's the effect that tragedy has on us. There's a catharsis of pity and fear. Okay, so let's try and sort of figure out what Aristotle's saying by this and how it helps us answer Plato. All right, so we've got to go through a couple of interpretations here. The simplest answer, I think, to what catharsis means is that it means something like purgation. Right, and this is called a medical interpretation, and this goes back to Freud, who sort of portrayed the idea as a kind of blowing off steam. Right, it's a kind of relief that we get by sort of releasing our emotions, discharging our emotions in a safe context. And that safe context, of course, is when we're watching a tragedy where, we see horrible things and we have these emotions, but we know that we're not really in fear. We know that it's not our lives that are really at stake. We're just sort of observers. We're just the audience. So we can blow off steam. We can release these emotions in a safe context. So that's the basic idea of purgation, as a kind of releasing and discharging of emotions, that they're kind of safely discharged by art. The problem with this interpretation, though, is that it seems to suggest that the emotions are eliminated. And it seems to be that this cannot really be what Aristotle means, since he thinks that the emotions are necessary to daily life, that they regulate our daily life. So we have to sort of amend the medical interpretation somewhat. It's not just blowing off steam. It's not that we sort of get rid of pity and fear, right? And from Aristotle's point of view, if we eliminate or sort of blow off and get rid of our emotions, that's not a good and healthy state to be in. It's like we're kind of automata. We're sort of walking around emotionless. We're not responding and sort of resonating to events as we should. So that's not a healthy state of affairs. So rather than getting rid of pity and fear, rather than sort of discharging them, what tragedy does, according to this medical ethical interpretation, is it brings them into due proportion. And it does that by discharging the excess of pity and fear, preventing excessive reactions to real life events. So the real danger on this interpretation for Aristotle is not pity and fear themselves. It's a kind of excessive pity and fear. It's an excessive emotional reaction. And the theory here is that what tragedy does almost is it kind of trains our emotions. It educates our emotions. It shows us that sometimes our emotions are excessive. It shows us that these particular reactions would be excessive in real life, and it sort of allows us to get our emotions into proportion to the events that are happening. It sort of trains them. So by preventing these excessive reactions, by allowing our emotions to sort of come into proportion with events, by allowing us to regulate them properly in relation to what's happening, tragedy allows us to express our emotions in the right way, according to the right events and in the right way, and allows us to discharge them properly, to express them properly. There's a couple of strengths of this interpretation, and the first one is that it gives us a good answer to Plato. Right? It shows us that Plato's solution of repressing the emotions is wrong, and that doesn't work because it hinders our capacity to cope with and regulate our emotions. Right? So what we really need is the capacity to regulate our emotions so we can respond properly to daily life. We want to respond with the right measure of emotion. Right? It's not, for Aristotle, it's not anger itself that's the problem. It's anger that doesn't match the situation. It's too much anger that's misdirected, anger that isn't in tune with what we should be feeling, right? And the same with sadness, the same with grief. It's the right expression of anger in the right proportion that matters. So Plato's idea that we kind of repress our emotions, we keep them under control, doesn't give us that capacity to regulate them, and just is likely to lead to more trouble, because if we're sort of repressing our emotions, they're liable to explode at moments of extreme stress rather than sort of being properly regulated. So it suggests that what we need to do is to bring them into proper proportion, to regulate them, and that repressing them is wrong. A second point maybe is that it matches, this interpretation matches how we feel when our emotions are moved by watching tragedy, where we feel relieved rather than empty, right? So it's not, at the end of a tragedy, we don't sort of feel completely empty and numb. We feel a sort of sense of relief that our emotions have been sort of attuned, that they've sort of got to work out rather than we've got rid of them. Okay, we've dealt with Plato's two objections, and we've seen responses to them, but there's a third interesting interpretation of catharsis, and that's known as the cognitive interpretation. And this comes from, there's an idea, another sort of translation of catharsis, where it can be kind of discharging or purging, but it can also be a kind of clarification. So according to the cognitive interpretation, tragedy clarifies by portraying the universal essences, which we talked about already, that Aristotle believes can be accessed by art. This is interesting because it means tragedy must be a philosophical teacher. Tragedy allows us to understand general aspects and tendencies of human experience and action. Okay, so we're not just looking at tragedy as entertainment. Of course, we're not just looking at tragedy as something that sort of as something that affects us, that sort of has an effect on us beyond our knowledge. Here we're talking about tragedy as something that educates and teaches us, and it teaches us about the general aspects and tendencies of human experience and action. So this takes us into a kind of cognitive understanding of tragedy. Now, an example of this comes in Oedipus the King, which is, at least based on the Poetics, it seems to be Aristotle's favorite tragedy, and it's one we'll look at closely in a week or so. So in Oedipus the King, we learn about the fundamental limitation of the human intellect in dealing with the unfathomable mystery that surrounds divine purpose. Right? So Oedipus, as we'll see, is characterized by this kind of ferocious intellect and this very kind of demanding attitude of impatience and restlessness, that he wants to know everything, and that comes into conflict with the unknowability of things, and the sign of that in the play, of course, is the work of fate. Oedipus's fate has already been decreed before he's born, and there's nothing he can do to change that. He can't even find out what that fate is. So there's this conflict between this desire to know and the kind of unknowableness of what's fundamentally important to us, our own fate and the meaning of our own lives. So that opposition is very, you can sort of see how that works in Oedipus. A question may be whether that focuses too much on metaphysical or religious knowledge rather than the psychological knowledge of human types, which is what Aristotle is after and what he talks about in the Poetics. This seems to be closer to the kind of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche interpretation that we'll look at very shortly, rather than really seem to fitting Aristotle's interpretation. It might be, however, that we want to say in response to these sort of different interpretations of catharsis, rather than thinking, we have to pick one of them and sort of reject the others, we might want to say maybe there's a multiplicity of benefits, and those benefits are both emotional and intellectual, that we get from tragedy, right? It's not one thing, it's a number of things. It sort of affects us emotionally, it affects us intellectually. So we can expect that it's going to sort of change us in a multitude of dimensions. Now, the tragic protagonist, or the tragic hero, so that's basically the central character in a tragic play, the person who is the subject of the tragic events. The tragic hero, Aristotle says, must be an intermediate kind of person, one who is neither greatly superior in virtue and justice nor greatly inferior. And this is because, this is essentially because we want to be able to identify with that person. And if we can't identify with them in this moral sense, Aristotle believes, then we're not going to be able to, we won't feel pity. We won't genuinely be able to sort of put ourselves in their place and feel this sense of unmerited misfortune and feel this sense of fear that it might happen to us. So this sense of that the tragic protagonist is somebody, a kind of intermediately good person, one who's not sort of super good or not, not evil or bad. That's the kind of person we can identify with, and that person is one that we can see ourselves in the tragedy, so we can feel the right emotions. The tragic hero must be superior in a social but not a moral sense. So if it's a sort of king, as it typically is, then the fall of the king involves the whole of society, and it sort of makes it makes those extra metaphysical dimensions of tragedy much clearer. An important concept that is also discussed in the Poetics is the idea of hamartia. Now, the word itself comes from archery, and it basically means missing the mark. It's like you took your shot, you tried to shoot the arrow, and you missed the mark. So it seems to be that its primary goal is not to ascribe moral blame or any kind of sort of blame in that sense to the protagonist. There's no kind of sense that they're a morally bad person. It suggests instead a kind of what Jung, I think, calls insightfully a kind of one-sidedness. It's having too much of something that would otherwise be a virtue. Right? Now, in Aristotle's theory of virtue, this is very clear, right? Because you have something like courage, and then you have a kind of deficiency and an excess on both sides. So if you have too little of the virtue of courage, you're in the realm of cowardice, right? So you need sort of more of that quality to make it into a virtue. But there comes a point in which if you sort of keep adding that quality, the virtue of courage turns into something else, right? It becomes another kind of vice. It becomes a kind of vice of what we would call brashness or foolhardiness, where it's not that you lack courage, it's that you have too much courage, right? You don't take into account the constraints of the situation. You don't take the appropriate precautions. You sort of rush headlong at the enemy before anyone else has got their camouflage and their equipment on. So it's that sense of being a kind of one-sidedness. It's not that you lack courage, but you go too far towards the other extreme. It's too much of something. We can see that in Oedipus's hubris, in his sort of thinking of himself as very smart, in his arrogance, and through those things we see a kind of, he's obviously a very clever thinker. He solves the riddle of the Sphinx, but nonetheless that becomes a kind of fault. It becomes a kind of one-sidedness when it goes too far. So that's what Aristotle's idea of hamartia is aiming at. It's this sense of this sort of one-sidedness where you're not morally blameworthy because you lack something, or you're a sort of bad character, but the way you exercise virtue doesn't match the situation, and that's the core of the problem. Okay, so let's see what we can conclude and what we can draw from what we've talked about here today. As we saw, Aristotle develops a theory of art and tragedy that answers Plato's claim of art's uselessness and harmfulness. And we saw that sort of uselessness idea in the painting argument and the harmfulness idea in the stiff upper lip argument, right, about the emotions and the role they play. So Aristotle's responses to both of those arguments shows that Plato's critique of art is misguided and wrong. And Aristotle is showing us that tragedy has a kind of useful social function. That tragedy has a kind of purpose, that it gives us insights. He argues that feeling emotions in the right way and at the right times is essential for human well-being. And that's, again, is a major difference between Aristotle and Plato. And that difference informs Aristotle's view of tragedy. Whereas we saw for Aristotle, tragedy is training the emotions. It's helping us feel things in the right way, develop the right sort of calibrate our responses to the way things are. And that sort of enables us to react and respond in the right way. As we saw as well, the tragic protagonist is not bad or evil, but one-sided. So they might have virtue to an excess, and that will create problems in particular circumstances. But it doesn't. We're not sort of talking about a moral flaw in the sense of the character being bad or evil. We're talking about a particular sort of an excess of a virtue or an excess of something that in ordinary circumstances we would think of as a good thing, as a kind of a virtue. But in these particular circumstances, there's a mismatch, and that creates problems.